Hello, everyone. I'm Nitasha Tiku, tech culture reporter for the Washington Post. We're going to be talking about what's at stake as big tech impacts society at large. We're joined by Frances Haugen, Facebook whistleblower and founder of Beyond the Screen, and Tracy Chou, founder and CEO of Block Party, an organization that builds tools for online safety and anti-harassment. Later, we'll be joined by Danielle Citron. Tracy and Frances, thank you for joining us. I'd like to start just by asking you both about your individual priorities in terms of tech's impact on society, civic life, our personal lives. Is there a particular issue right now that's really important to you or that you want to highlight?
I can go first. So with Block Party, we are trying to build tools for online safety, and that is top of mind for me, making it so that people can be online and participate in digital spaces and feel comfortable and in control of their experience and able to partake in all the good that is possible from being online. I know sometimes we get lost in the conversations just talking about all the harms and how terrible things are, but there is actually a lot of really good stuff online. And we want to bring back that magic of what is possible when a lot of people are connected online, the democratization of information and access and connection, like all that good stuff. And part of making that possible for people to access is the online safety component.
I would say my biggest priority is quite similar to when I first came out as a whistleblower, which is I really believe in the democratic process. And that doesn't mean, the government coming in and saying, you can say this, you can't say this. It's more about the question of, we deserve to have a say in how these systems are built and governed. And we've basically come to accept over time that because they're free products, we should just feel grateful that, we get to access them, that we don't have to pay for them. When we should be saying, hey, we live more and more of our lives in these digital spaces. We would never consider not having a town council. We would never not consider having a school board because we like to have influence on things that directly impact our lives. And so this question of, what information does the public need in order to do the rituals of democratic governance? What level of transparency needs to be mandated of platforms so that we can take actions? Maybe that's an advertiser boycott. Maybe that's a usage boycott. Maybe that's divestment. Maybe that's just, people actually sitting and protesting these companies. What would it take for us to have a similar level of transparency to what we have with, say, automobiles? Because I think there's a lot of potential for us to unlock the different mechanisms within the ecosystem of accountability if you actually can get over that hill of opacity.
And, you both have been really active in advocating for consumers, for protecting consumers. But I think, we're seeing with the gold rush around generative AI, right? Some of the same harms and patterns repeat themselves with emerging technology. And we're seeing regulators kind of take a wait and see approach a little bit. And really the only thing then that stands between the consumers and potential risks are the policies of the companies. I'm just wondering, what you both think. Are there ways that we can protect ourselves as consumers? Like how would you try to get involved, I guess, or how do you wish that this new generation of tech was unfolding a little differently?
One of the conversations I wish we had around generative AI is about, what are the tools that are available to us to put pressure on these systems to move in the right direction. People have advocate for things like a pause, and that usually makes like my blood run a little hot because we're dealing with technologies that have a very, very low barrier to entry and are extremely have extremely high potential in at least the short run, but at the risk of extremely high long-term, say, existential risk. One of the things that I wish more people would come in and do is say things like, the Fortune 500 should get together and say, hey, we will only buy generative AI products that follow the following safety protocols. There are ways of creating market incentives where we say, hey, you can go off and do crazy research and potentially be quite dangerous, but we're not going to make large amounts of capital available to you to do this. And it feels a little bit like we're still searching for we've kind of fallen in a rut when it comes to how we regulate technology over the last 20 years, where if it's an issue beyond, if it's a lever beyond privacy, antitrust, and God, what's the third one? There's a third one. There's like a very limited toolkit that we've used. And I think coming in and trying to think about this a little more creatively and saying, you know, let's actually think about incentives. Like let's figure out how to make incentives for people to do good things, not just incentives to keep people from doing bad things.
One thing I wish we had more in the conversation is an explicit discussion of what are the values and trade-offs. I think we often talk about like, oh, there's this harm. Like, okay, sure. But like, there's also sometimes a trade-off of harms. For example, in the space that I know well, like with harassment, sometimes you have tools that protect against harassment, but the cost of potentially increasing misinformation. And just having very explicit discussions around what are the things that we value? Do we want more data privacy, or do we want usability and user convenience? Making it super explicit in the discussions with consumers as well as with legislators makes, I think, all those conversations just more productive and meaty, as opposed to talking in the ideal sense of like protect against harm. So of course, nobody's going to say like we shouldn't protect against harms, but when we get into the specifics of like, what does that mean? Like, what are we going to trade off? I think the privacy example is one that is very salient. It's very easy to say users should have more privacy, but users also want usability, and like they want to be able to use things without thinking about having to enter all their information all the time. And so being more explicit in discussing what these trade-offs are, I think would help all of us in understanding like how can we actually try to resolve some of these tensions? How do we move forward productively, whether it's with tech company policies or with legislation?
I wanted to build on that question around values, right? That when we, right now, kind of our primary framing for how are we going to get safety off of these systems is we have teams that are known as alignment organizations within these AI companies that try to align it with our values. And one of the things that I think people should really be talking about quite openly is that every one of these generative AIs that's out there right now has a bunch of baked in values, but we don't get to see what they are. You know, we can kind of intuit what they are by penetration testing them, by throwing lots of queries at them and seeing what kind of responses come back. But that doesn't facilitate really consumer choice. Like you don't get to really pick products that have alignment with your values because you don't know what values went into that, what decisions went into that. And it's the thing where that we don't get to have a democratic discussion on what should be the baseline level of safety for these products.
It sounds like you're advocating at the very least for transparency.
It's the way you start conversations. You know, we can't have the most basic market incentives if people don't actually get to choose between products. And the thing that we saw with social media was we got these huge network effects, which means that people didn't really get to make choices. They got locked into systems. But even then, they didn't really know what they were choosing because there was a difference between the narrative that was said publicly and how the systems actually performed. When it comes to generative AI, we should expect a lot more competition because there is less of that protective moat and because the cost for development is relatively lower. But unless we have mandated ways for researchers, for governments, for activists to be able to probe these systems, you don't really get to choose products that are aligned with your values. You have to kind of guess, what kinds of values were baked into the system by their alignment team.
Right. Actually, just to build on that even further, I think beyond the transparency, to be able to see what's happening there, one thing that we care very much about at Block Party is having access to these systems programmatically such that we can build additional tooling. So it's no longer just seeing what's there and what's already been built by the companies, but being able to build different experiences. Without API access to some of these social media platforms, we're just locked into whatever Facebook wants us to do, whatever TikTok wants to show us, whatever Twitter wants to show us. And there's actually no possibility for choice. Even if you have transparency, you can see what they're doing, but there's no way for other people to build alternative experiences. You still don't have choice. You just know that you are locked into the one thing. So we care very much about getting that sort of programmatic access to build different consumer solutions as well.
And Tracy, I'm just now seeing with Blue Sky, this new Twitter competitor, which I know you're on as well. They're inching towards some of the values and features that you at Block Party have already offered, that you've kept your users protected on social networks like Twitter and other places where they're facing harassment. It's one of the few areas where I'm seeing like incremental improvement. So I'm wondering, like, what advice can you give, or what can you tell us about where pressure was put on stakeholders to start to try to, to make companies see that they needed to start to change, to offer something different, to offer some control to users?
There's a bunch of different ways to try to make a point and create change. One of them in this space was just showing that it's not that hard to make things better. And I've actually talked to a lot of now former Twitter employees who said it was really powerful to see Block Party build on top of the Twitter API and create such a better experience for users in a very simple way, where internally at a lot of different platform companies, trust and safety folks have run into the hurdles of being told, like, it's just a hard problem, like we can't make it any better, like we are doing our best, we just can't do any better. And I almost single-handedly built, like literally coded all of this for Block Party. It was like, it's actually not that hard. Like a single developer with a little bit of like, a little bit of resourcing can actually build an experience that's meaningfully better without any really specially privileged access. So I think even just like that proof point of it can be better unlocked a lot of possibility in people's minds around like what they could be doing. I think the other thing was showing platforms that they don't have to be the ones to solve all of the problems. Clearly, they have a lot of responsibility, and there are some things that really only the platform is positioned to do, and there are some things that a centralized actor may need to take charge of. So things like misinformation or like really harmful speech about a single person that's directing a lot of hate towards them, like some of that needs to be taken down at a platform level. But there's a lot of other things that the platform doesn't need to be involved with. So like individual user controls, the platforms may not want to build out all of this tooling themselves. It's a lot of end product design work, a lot of resourcing that has to go into some of these different feature sets and consumer experiences. And there are other people who want to build these solutions. One thing that was a big learning for me going to more international conferences and speaking to people in journalism and politics in a more global setting was the frustration from folks that everything that Facebook and Twitter does is very US centric, like maybe a little bit of EU. But there's all these other folks who are like, there's like one representative in all of South America to deal with like a certain set of elections issues. Like that's ridiculous. And there's a lot of like local organizations, local developers that want to be able to build this tooling, but are locked out right now. And so having that access could just empower so many different use cases, different locales, languages, contexts. And I think, again, just sort of the proof point that we made of we can build this tool, look how much more could be possible was very useful as showing like a path forward around some really gnarly problems that we've been struggling with for a long time.
And to build on kind of that little flavor in there, we have been living with a model of how we should think about these platforms where we're very passive. Ethan Zuckerman at UMass Amherst has this metaphor that we've been living in a world where we have been subjects of kings. We live on these systems where we don't get any say. If we don't like the rules, we can go to another kingdom, but like we're just choosing another king. Like we're not really having a different relationship. I think the thing that's so exciting about what Tracy's doing is in order for efforts to facilitate more people taking hands-on action, is that I think there is a future for social media where we are citizens, we are not subjects, where we expect to do things like jury duty. We expect to play a role in keeping systems safe, instead of just having this idea that we have to accept whatever the baseline is. Because like she said, the version of Facebook you use if you speak English and live in the United States is the cleanest, safest version in the world. And that's intentional. If we want to have systems that are linguistically equitable and scale for the amount of linguistic diversity in the world, we have to use models like what Tracy's doing.
Frances, the way that these American multinationals, Facebook in particular, operate in the global South was something that, you really tried to highlight. Now with the layoffs in big tech, we're seeing companies in particular cut back on their content efforts, in some of these countries. And I am wondering, what do you think will happen? What do you think, is there a way to prevent what I guess we all kind of anticipate is going to happen?
So I always like to say I am a pessimist in the short term and an optimist in the long term. So one of the ways we have historically corrected when we have invented new forms of media is it has been very, very, very bad for a period of time. And then we make decisions that we don't want to do that anymore. And I was really, really shocked. I think it was last year when the Kenya TikTok riots happened. So there was an election in Kenya. There was ethnic violence that was facilitated or amplified because of misinformation and violence inciting content on TikTok. And I had thought we were going to have 5 years before we would see that kind of thing. You know, video takes much, much more bandwidth, which means it's more expensive. You need higher quality phones. It doesn't have the same penetration that Facebook does. Like Facebook is the internet in many countries in Africa, for example, because they have a stripped down, very bare bones version of Facebook where you can interact with text and pick pictures. And what's terrifying is TikTok is because it separates out the actual relationships between people because it's so much more facilitated by this kind of all-knowing, all-seeing algorithm. It's a system that really is only safe when it is actively censored. When you have systems that you can pull from hundreds of millions of videos, and the algorithm is tuned specifically to make things go super, super viral. You know, they want a very small number of pieces of content, a few thousand, say, making up the vast majority of what everyone sees. And they do that intentionally because in places like China or in the United States, they go and they manually screen all those most viral items. But in places like, Kenya, I've heard from people on the inside, they didn't have any Swahili speaking moderators while that violence was going on. And part of what I found horrifying about the last 6 months was Facebook, in the wake of my disclosures, seemed to invest more in safety. But because their stock has been flagging, Mark Zuckerberg decided that this was going to be their year of efficiency. And they've done things like halve the number of moderators in East Africa. And so I'm really, really worried that we have built closed private systems and then done incentives to make it such that they are the internet in some of the most vulnerable places in the world. And then we've chosen not to invest in safety for them. And I have a book coming out this summer called The Power of One, where I go in great detail to how this happened and why it's happening. And I think unless we do decentralized systems where we really have the users playing an active role in safety, we're not going to build technologies that can scale to the 4,000 or 5,000 languages that exist in the world.
And do you think that that's something that tech companies would allow? Access to users to moderate their own systems?
Well, I think it's this question of how many people are going to die before we do these things, right? Like it's one of these things where we have, when I joined Facebook, there had been a social media facilitated genocide, Myanmar. It wasn't the opinion of random people inside the company or random people on the internet. Like the UN came out and said this was a social media facilitated genocide. During just the time period I was at Facebook, we also had Ethiopia take place. And we should expect to see more and more of these incidences happen over the next few years as more people come online, as things like video become more and more present, images become more and more present. It sounds weird to us sitting in the United States with fancy smartphones, but there's lots, for billions of people on the internet, they're just moving into a world where they can have regular access to lots of video. I think it's in many, many problems, there is a body count that we accept until we don't accept it anymore. And I think the thing that is so tragic is I think a lot of people are going to die before we hit that line and we start saying, okay, we have to figure out solutions to scale because we're just going to see more mass casualty events.
Right. I think that's sort of, to be realistic. I mean, I back to sort of what Tracy was talking about with the trade-offs. That was really helpful insight into, I mean, you both have worked inside these big tech companies, and I think that was a much more realistic look at what the discussions that are actually happening, right? Like no one's saying we want to take away your privacy. It's always going to be a trade-off. Like Tracy, like, could you give a little bit of insight into how those discussions happen inside a tech company in a way that might help us like really understand? Yeah.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to add into the conversation we're just having about when is this going to change? Like, when is this going to be fixed? I think it is a question that we can answer by looking at the system incentives. And right now, it's almost purely these capitalist incentives of have more engagement, drive more advertiser impressions, and make more money in that way. And we're willing to tolerate some casualties along the fringes if the stock price is still going up or if there's enough money. A couple ways to try to intervene in this system are regulation, where there's a cost associated with this. I've actually talked to trust and safety folks who are like, we're actually really excited about regulation coming in where there will be a dollar cost associated with our work. So instead of it being a feel good effort, it's like, no, we are the team that's responsible for making sure we don't incur these massive fines that actually have an impact on the bottom line of the business. So it's one way in which we can try to intervene. Other things that I would look at in terms of like, what are the system incentives beyond the more capitalist side? Look at what are the KPIs that companies set and how do individual actors orient around the company level KPIs, key performance indicators. How do they set goals? A lot of tech companies use OKRs, objectives and key results, that they look at on an individual basis, team basis, all the way up to company basis on a quarterly level. And it turns out that a lot of our incentives are aligned around solving certain types of problems. And you get more promotions and a better chance at career advancement if you work on certain types of problems, and less so if you work on others. So, I have heard from some of the folks who worked on health and safety teams that their teams weren't the ones that you would go to if you wanted to be promoted. Like, if you want to get promoted, you go work on an infrastructure team where you're going to work on something that affects the entire user base, and you get to write in your self-performance rating when you're going up for promotion that you worked on something that impacted 1 billion users, and you drove key metrics for the company around like advertiser dollars a certain way. It's not as impactful to the business if you can say, oh, we did this many takedowns of bad content. Like, it is a metric that you can point to, but the more that your personal goals are tied to the company goals, the better off you are. So I think it really is looking at all of these incentives within the company, not just sort of like the business incentives, but also the individual incentives around how do they get career advancement, how do they get influence, and trying to solve the structural incentives, which may be regulation coming in to at least put like a big dollar at the very top, so that these teams have a real justification for their work.
Do you think that they are just, they're also like that is related to what they choose to measure? Like, if they could choose to measure the way that Instagram made you feel, right? Like, or is that, are those things hard to measure?
I think it's harder to measure, but it ultimately has to tie to what is the business rationale for these things. So you might have your key objectives that you're trying to optimize, and you might have guardrail metrics as well, but you're not optimizing those guardrail metrics. Like, it's much more likely you would see, I haven't worked at Instagram, but it's much more likely you would see, like, they're trying to increase engagement while trying to make sure that people aren't too unhappy. So maybe like happiness or mental health is a guardrail metric, but it's not going to be the thing that they optimize. Which also is an interesting segue into looking at like more the consumer choice side of things. If there are more open APIs so that other companies, like my own Block Party, we're building different experiences. Like, our goal is to optimize for the end user and making them happy. Like, our goal is actually aligned with the user experience and their incentives as opposed to the platform incentives. And so some of the possibility here with regulation enforcing some level of openness, we are already starting to see some of this in the EU with the DMA requirements around open APIs for interoperability. It's opening up this possibility for more consumer experiences that are actually aligned to end users and giving them more choice instead of being locked into whatever makes the most sense for the platform companies.
I think there's also a question of like, a lot of these things are probabilistic future costs versus immediate costs, right? So like, if you're sitting there and saying like, there's a high chance that this forest fire is going to come through, But the forest fire is going to come through sometime between now and 5 years from now. And you're likely only going to stay at the company for 2 or 3 years. It's very hard for you to fight that fight when you may never pay that cost. And so you have a situation where I think a lot of trust and safety people end up in situations where the thing that keeps us safe is literally the goodwill of trust and safety people. They voluntarily are slowing their careers down. They're voluntarily often putting up with headaches that they wouldn't face if they were working in, say, the growth part of the company or the ads part of the company. And you have these really dangerous trade-offs where inside of Facebook, the turnover is so fast. By the time I left, so I was there for about 2 years, I was more senior than like 85% of the company. So in a world where like you have very quick turnover, do you really want the optimization for society as a whole to be made by someone who's not likely going to be around to actually pay for the costs of not putting out the forest or like, trimming the undergrowth in the forest?
How can we put the pressure on the folks who stay there because it pays for them to stay there, who have the objectives that are, that are the best rewarded, who maybe work in growth or, like you both understand, how these companies work. You've talked to the advocates, you are the advocates. Like, where can we as consumers or outsiders throw our attention or our voices?
So given I'm guessing a lot of your audience is going to be in the United States and likely speaks English, given I'm speaking to them in English right now. I want to draw attention to the fact that Europe passed something called the Digital Services Act last year. And we could pass a law like that in the United States. So the Digital Services Act says, hey, we have these opaque systems. They know that as long as they can hide behind the curtain, they can optimize for their own business objectives. And people aren't aware that their corners being cut. Like, they're not aware that the forest now hasn't been maintained in years, and that it's full of kindling. We have a right as consumers that if they know there's a risk, they should tell us. And that sounds so basic. It sounds so basic to be like, hey, if you know you're poisoning us, you need to tell us. But like, that's literally what the law says, that you have to do mandatory risk assessments. And if you don't consider a risk, we're allowed to ask you about it. And what's your plan for making that risk smaller? Oh, and by the way, if we ask you for data, you can't go and say, sorry, we're not going to give it to you anymore. Like, you have to engage in a conversation with us. And so the thing I'm always trying to remind people is that we can have different relationships with these platforms. And like, that's the piece of hope I always try to leave people with, is that we shouldn't take for granted that powerlessness is inevitable, right? Or powerlessness is the only way we can have relationships with these companies. We don't accept children dying in car accidents for preventable reasons. We shouldn't accept that these companies are allowed to operate carte blanche just because that's the way we did it 20 years ago.
Yeah, I would just say +1. But I do like the focus on legislation, regulation, and pushing people to think about being involved in that process. You don't need to be the one necessarily writing the policy, but flagging that this is important to your representatives and pushing them to think critically about how they can solve some of these problems in a more structural way. I think that's likely the way that we'll have most persistent change. If you're relying on the goodwill of people within companies, when they're going to have their own incentives as well, like they need to feed their families and like pay off loans or whatever it is, like that goodwill will only last so long if you want to build these structural solutions. And I think right now we have the law as one way that we can try to affect that. So there's much more that we can do within the US, modeling after what the EU is doing. In some cases, actually just general like consumer sentiment can sway platforms as well. I'm thinking about some of the cases with Instagram where they were trying to roll out changes to make them more like TikTok, and a lot of the influencers were very upset about this and spoke up against it, and at least got Instagram to like think a little bit differently about what they were rolling out. It's harder, I think, to affect change in that way because it kind of relies on getting a few key decision makers at these platform companies to think that you have like a credible threat. If it's celebrities like Taylor Swift threatening to leave your platform, then it matters. I don't know how much like a bunch of like individual users will impact the platforms unless it becomes at a scale that is impossible to ignore.
Right. Yeah. For so long, that felt like, asking consumers to make a personal choice when it's a structural issue. But I don't know, all of a sudden it feels like there might be enough momentum that like we could maybe choose with our feet. Yeah.
My dream, and I there's a lot of stuff going on in my life, so who knows if I'll get around to this. But my dream in the next like year or two is we should be like gluing ourselves to the highway outside of Facebook, right? Like that's the level of crisis we're in. Like we're in the crisis. Like if you knew there was a Holocaust coming, you knew there were millions of people that were going to die. Like what would you do? And I think that's the thing that we really need in the United States is that these are I was in France and they throw this phrase around much more freely than we do in the United States. They're digital colonial companies. They extract huge amounts of money across other countries. They leave all the externalities, all the costs behind, and people are going to die. People are dying. And so there's this question of like, what is it going to take for us to stand up in the big tech's backyard and say like, this is unacceptable. Like I'm not like, I think we're going to look back and we have an opportunity now to not be horrified by what happened. And so that's my hope. So come glue yourself to the highway with me. It'll be fun. It'll be a sunny day. The weather is always nice in Menlo Park. It'll be fun.
That's true. It's a great view. Right outside that. Look at
the bay is beautiful.
Yeah.
Just saying.
All right. Thank you both for making the time. Now I'll turn to Danielle Citron, a legal scholar on cyber harassment and the author of The Fight for Privacy. Danielle, a pleasure to speak with you today. I would like to start just by talking to you about, what do you think is the most, I guess, your biggest priority for the potential harms that you think big tech is posing for society right now? Like, what is your focus for this year?
So I've been writing about the privacy that's afforded our intimate life. So the privacy, of course, of our bodies, our thoughts, our health, our sexual orientation, sexual activities, and our close relationships. And I think I hope that our conversation centers on intimate privacy and just its centrality to our flourishing, to our engagement, to our ability to love and to connect with other people and to make the most out of all these tools that promise us that they're good for us, right? We use all these tools and services, our browsers, our apps, our digital, assistants. And the idea is that like, they're going to make our lives easier and better. And what we woefully underestimate and really just can't appreciate because of the scale, because we don't see data kind of flying out of our heads and hands, is that it provides the most intimate detail of our bodies, our pregnancies, our termination of pregnancies, where we go, who we're sleeping with, what we're doing, what we're reading, what we're thinking and fantasizing, and all of that is weaponized, especially against the most vulnerable, right? So I'm worried about so much of what we go about our daily lives thinking we have intimate privacy. We want it, we expect it, and we don't have it. And it's not only just companies, individuals, companies, but companies are the handmaidens to government. And in an era where, our reproductive choices in 13 states, could either lead to the arrest of health providers, ourselves, meaning people terminating pregnancies, lawsuits against people helping them terminate a pregnancy, which we have seen already. I guess I feel like I'm in mortal terror every day. And in a way that feels so immediate to me, but I think it's really hard for people to appreciate because it's not visceral. Like we don't see it as the data flies out of our hands, as it's recorded in our apps. Does that make sense? Like we don't see the reservoirs of intimate data and government's access to it and private companies, but it is there and it's being exploited.
Yeah, and you and I have talked about this before, but I find like your experience having researched this and talked to so many individuals through the years. Could you talk a little bit about like how, it's so easy, right, when there's emerging technology to imagine the potential harms. And can you talk about how, when deepfakes first came out, some of the harms you imagine and how it actually played out?
Absolutely. Sort of when So when Bobby Chesney and I first started writing about deep fakes in, I want to say February of 2018, he's a national security scholar. I write about privacy, democracy, equality. And I said to him, I said, Bobby, there's no question to me that downstream national security, democracy, we've got big stuff coming, but who's going to be the canary in the coal mine, which was true then and remains true today, are women, right? Women and, women of color, celebrities, non-celebrities, whose faces are morphed into porn in an incredibly hyper realistic way, appear online and in ways that we have no control over. And, when we first started writing about it, 2018, 2019, I think there was something like 20,000 deep fakes online, and 98% of them were of women's faces morphed into porn. And here we are, we're 2023. 2022, a study came out from Sensity. It was something like more than 60,000 deep fakes were detected online. 95% again were of essentially created manufactured porn, and 98% or 99% of those faces were female presenting faces, right? And so in a way, like the fact of the matter is, like, who does it mostly cost in the moment? We often see intimate privacy violations, and who's first are the most vulnerable, right? And it's not to say we're not going to see it, and we're already seeing it, mischief, corporate mischief, use of audio, like faked audio saying, send me a wire, right? Or, faked audio here again, like we're seeing the deep fake phenomenon weaponized in what Bobby and I call the liar's dividend, which was where you see a real video. It's genuine, it's of mischief. And someone says, it's all fake, right? Like it's a deep fake. And so it's true that we're increasingly seeing the threats propagate in all sorts of ways, right? Democracy invading, CEO like destroying lives, of companies, emptying bank accounts. But it's true that like where you first see it in the, misuses of technology is often the first victims are the easiest, right? Whose bodies aren't, there aren't, what do they say, bulletproof, they're the ones who are going to be, their bodies are viewed as disgusting and stigmatized.
Mm-hmm. And how are you finding having these conversations with the companies, with lawmakers, here in 2023? It feels increasingly difficult to have grounded conversations as we're trying to imagine the potential of this technology. And as you said, the problems with deep fakes, they're only increasing. So how are you finding receptiveness to these ongoing harms to women and women of color?
So interesting, because when I first started writing about the phenomenon in 2019, there were like, I had testified before Congress, like in 2 committee hearings. We saw it as like an imminent threat to national security. So it was like I was before the HPSI committee, the Permanent Select Intelligence Committee, and things have kind of quieted. That is, we saw some state legislatures like make some moves, banning like deep fakes around an election, like within 48 hours, and also deep fake sex videos. So this, manufactured digital forgeries of where we're depicting someone involved in a sex act. A couple of states, I think there's 6 in total or 7. But things have been quite quiet, and it disturbs me, right? It's not as if things have gotten less significant. They've grown or tripled, quadrupled in number in the ways that are detectable. They're very familiar problems. We have seen there's one proposal in Congress, what we call, Dr. Marianne Franks has been working on behalf of our organization called the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative with a lawmaker in the House to think about ways to penalize digital forgeries that are defamatory, like in a careful and narrow way. But it's interesting because it's been quite quiet in ways that are surprising, the inverse of like problem set overreaction. Like we predicted problems, they weren't as prevalent. People were really interested. Let's legislate, let's work 2019. And all of a sudden, here we are. I guess you're not surprised at all, having covered this speed for so long, 2023. And it seems with the exception of like one House representative, and maybe it's dysfunction in government, but it's quite quiet, though the problem keeps escalating. and the deep fakery audio and video getting even more sophisticated in ways, and like, you know, now you have deep fakes as a service. So like it costs you nothing, like $50 you get exactly what you want, the person doing exactly what you want them to be doing, which is could be like ultra human, you know what I mean, like, and really disfiguring awful things that you can create. And so the problem's gotten worse. I worry that, and you asked about companies too, companies have worked terrific, like Johnny on the Spot in the Moment 2019, when we saw increasing prevalence and discussion about deep fakery, and they adopted, you know, the biggest platforms, policies against fabricated, digitally, you know, altered video and audio. And, but it's kind of stopped, right? So it's not to say that the phenomenon has stopped. We saw some moves, Twitter, Meta, you know, then Facebook, you know, other companies, TikTok absolutely bans digital forgeries. But there are 9,500 sites whose raison d'etre is intimate image abuse, and they're not banning it. That's their business model. And so does that make sense? Like some of the biggest platforms, and I'm not saying bravo, but glad they're working with us on it, right? Some of the biggest ones. But at the same time, you've got a whole ecosystem of sites who are immune from liability under federal law, and they thrive. They have subscribers. They earn money from our data, whether they're called Mr. Deepfakes, Anon IB. You know what I'm saying? Like there's a whole ecosystem of sites who make so much money off of the fakery that's usually aimed at women and people of color and sexual and gender minorities.
Do you have a sense, since you have such like you have so much expertise in this area and such a sense of this ecosystem, is there an area where advocates or consumers could put pressure on stakeholders that would make a real difference, especially if we're seeing legislators just kind of take this wait and see approach with women's safety?
Yeah, no, and I've one inspire. I feel like so I have a new book, The Fight for Privacy, that, you know, it's sort of the bleak story, but like end with some hope. And what I can say is we can bring moral suasion to the table in ways we don't even realize we have so much power. But South Korea is like an incredible example. So in 2018, basically women and girls couldn't go to the public bathrooms without being recorded and then having it be streamed online. And women who would have to bring, if they did go to the bathroom, like what they called molka kits, which is it would have silicone, you'd fill in like any holes in the bathroom, pre-pandemic masks, you know, they had like provisions. And basically you didn't pee. You did not go to the restroom. And this is where like I'm just kind of overwhelmed with admiration. Women and allies and girls and their allies took to the streets 5 times in 2018. The first march was something like 25,000 people in Seoul. 2 months later, 45,000 people. And they all had signs in English and Korean that said, "My life is not your porn." So it was really designed for a global conversation, not just Korea, you know, like a conversation, not just their law enforcement, not just their parliament and, you know, but for everyone. And 2 months later after that, 50,000 people. After that, 75,000. And the final march, so this is the 5th, it's December, it's 2018, it's freezing. 125,000 people took to the streets of Seoul to say, "My life is not your porn." No more filming me in the bathroom, and no more calling it a joke. Molka is like a jokey name for hidden camera in Korean. And the Korean government created what's called the Digital Sex Crime Content Commission. It's amazing. I've been working with them ever since. They listen to their advocates in Korea, and instead of calling it Molka, which is like a joke, like a hidden camera, haha, they call it, as advocates wanted, digital sex crime information or content. And it's like a whole society approach. Like they support, so victims or individuals who, you know, they get support for psychiatric help with jobs if they've lost their jobs, which is often the case. They lose their job, the filmer, you know, irrelevant, they're never caught. Law enforcement is now have increased enhanced penalties. They're enforcing those laws. They now have liability that relates to platforms hosted in Korea. So now, though it's hard because so much of the content is hosted outside the US. You know, like that's their biggest struggle, is like these sites that are hosted mostly in the US, Russia and the Netherlands, right? These 9,500 sites, But I've been so impressed. You know, you asked, like, what can we do? Is there any way, if lawmakers are going to sit on their hands and, I think you beautifully said it, wait and see? You know what I mean? Like, if the pressure's not on, they're just going to be like, well, let's see what happens. Which it does feel like in this moment, that's what's happening. Um, uh, we can take to the streets. Like, whether we need a spark, remember with Jennifer Lawrence and the fappening, when her nude photos and other celebrities' photos were leaked to the cloud and then exploited on Reddit and 4chan and 8chan. And, you know, she speaks out and speaks to Vanity Fair and said this was a virtual sexual assault. Like, I don't want that. I don't want to have that moment, right? Like, where very high profile people are exploited. But whatever it is, we need to take to the streets, because if they could do it in Korea, we can do it here. Does that make sense? Like, I have such belief in us. Like, if we've seen it, you know what I mean? Like, I really do. Right. We saw the
Getting chills. Like I do. And, you know, think about how much Reddit has transformed since that time. Like it
yes,
was seen as a joke. You know, it took
yes,
so long for it to be seen as assault, as a crime. The whole platform has transformed in a way, you know, since then. So I think that
yes.
also shows
And they're
that.
doing better. They were not great for a while. Like, there were sites I used to report it. Poor Steve Hoffman. I'm busy writing to him too. Like, dude, there are NCII subreddits, like, but they have cracking down on them now. And the deep fake, you know, Mr. Deepfake started on the subreddit, right, in 2018, and they took that down. You're right. So they've been proactive. They could always do better at scale. They could always do better, but it is encouraging, right? So if we can bug those folks, right, and their business model is engagement, if we can bring moral suasion to them to say it's not good for business, right? We're going to protest. Then I think we can. Like, I'm not giving up on us, with the public, right? Us, you know, advocates together as a project.
That's wonderful. I think that's a great place to end it. I'm persuaded. Thank you, Danielle, so much for making the time. We really appreciate it.
And thank you so much for having me and for all your brilliant coverage. I really appreciate it.